What's up, Spiceheads? Welcome back. We've got another great event today hosted by DigiCert. So we're going to be talking all about the danger side of the Internet of Things and how PKI infrastructure might be one of the solutions that can help make it just a little bit safer. And so for more on this, we got an expert from DigiCert today that I'm pleased to introduce you to today. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Mike Nelson. Mike, welcome to the show today. How's it going?
Hey, Justin. It's good. It's great to be with you. I appreciate it.
Cool. Mike, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do for DigiCert?
Yeah, so Mike Nelson, I'm Vice President of IoT Security at DigiCert, and my role is, about 4.5 years ago, or 4 years ago, they brought me in public key infrastructure as a known security solution, and it is applicable in a lot of different ways. And they brought me in to start up an IoT practice utilizing PKI to secure connected devices. So that's my role. Today, we've provisioned over 2 billion IoT certificates, and that number is growing rapidly.
All right, wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us today, Mike. We are definitely looking forward to hearing from you. Before we go any further, a couple things I did want to talk about. If you do have questions for Mike, we're going to be taking all of your questions later on in the show. So make sure to get your questions into the Q&A widget down below. And make sure to also check out the other downloadable assets that DigiCert's providing for us today. A lot of good stuff for you guys to see. And if you guys would like to pop into chat, always great to see all of our favorite folks, including Pat Blue the Pirate, Death by Band-Aid, Ben Setliff, all of some of our favorites. You can pop that chat button open. We just ask that if you do, you make sure that you keep the professional and IT pro and make sure that everyone's having good and positive time. And as a special thank you for hanging out with us today, two of y'all are going to be walking away with a 34-inch LG ultra-wide IPS gaming monitor. So we'll be announcing the winner of that at the end of the show. And make sure to stick around for the winner as well as the questions that we'll be taking on later on. All right. Well, Mike, let's start off, pretty high level. I think everyone has had IoT on their radar as a security risk for quite some time. But being that you're closer to the action, how big of a risk have IoT devices become? What are some of this more surprising exploits that you've seen in your line of work?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot, is how big is the problem? And, I think that there's two rules of thought here. I think you see people out that are using scare tactics to drive attention to the issue. And the issue is very real, and there are a lot of scary scenarios. The truth is we don't see a lot of actual exploits where consumers are being harmed. We see devices being attacked by security researchers and other things like that. We know that the vulnerabilities are real, and there have been a handful of scenarios that have played out in public that have the potential to impact consumer safety. The problem is very real. The amount of exploits that we're seeing is on the rise, but we're not seeing anything yet where I would say there's a widespread case of hackers that are going after individuals and utilizing IoT devices to cause harm to people.
What do you feel like are maybe some of the worst case scenarios right now based on what you have actually identified as a security risk?
Yeah, so if you look at some of the research that has been done, let's take Charlie Miller. If you look at the automotive space, cars are starting to connect every component in the vehicle. You have ECUs, and all those ECUs are connecting up to a central hub, and that central hub is typically connecting to an outside source. All of those connections are vulnerable. Charlie Miller, several years back, he demonstrated the ability, while sitting in his living room, he put someone in a Jeep Cherokee and had them drive on the freeway. The vehicle was going approximately 70 miles an hour. And there's a video for those of you who are looking for some entertainment out on YouTube. There's a video of him hacking into this Jeep. He gets in through the infotainment system of the vehicle and was then able to pivot. And he showed that he was able to exploit a handful of vulnerabilities just because those connections weren't properly authenticated and they weren't checking to make sure that they were trusted. He was able to get in. The first thing he did was like turn the windshield wipers on,
Oh my
then
gosh.
turned on the AC, and then it got a lot more serious. He was able to lock the steering wheel. So you can
Oh my
imagine the
God.
panic that would set in as you're driving down the freeway going 70 miles an hour. And then ultimately, he was able to shut the engine of the vehicle off, all sitting on his couch in his living room while this car is miles away driving down the freeway. So, you think about that. I've got a bunch of kids. If I'm driving down the freeway, that's a pretty scary scenario to put yourself in.
I can't believe all those systems were accessible through, whatever internet port that was available. I mean, you're talking about like brakes and like the steering wheel. I guess, power steering has to go through a computer.
It's a pivot. He was able to get into the system, and then he was able to pivot from there and get into the other ECUs and take control of them. It was a sophisticated hack. It wasn't something he woke up one morning and was like, all right, I'm going to do. It took him some time to figure out how to do it, and it took a lot of planning. I've had a lot of conversations with him about it and his approach, but it can be done, and that was the scary thing. And the end result of that was Jeep recalled. It was the biggest car recall in a long time. I think it was 1.5 million vehicles to fix that vulnerability.
All right. So, I mean, and what I've heard is that, part of the problem is that IoT is such a hot market. The consumers are such a demand that people are rushing out to market and they're not taking the time to prioritize security. Is that still the case? I mean, are you seeing for the most part, you would hope the car manufacturers would, yes, be hopefully taking a little bit longer time, especially after, that video surfaced. But in general, are you finding that there is a better awareness among the manufacturers among the importance of security in IoT devices?
Yeah, it's really a mixed basket, Justin. I look at activity that's taking place in some of the critical infrastructure industries, so automotive, healthcare, industrial control, some of those large-scale systems that our country society is dependent on to be functional. We do see a lot of activity going in those areas. Consumer devices, it's kind of a mixed bag. There's really a rush to get IoT devices to the market because people are buying them and they're bringing so much value to consumers' lives. And so we still see security overlooked. I always say that people typically act based on two motivators, pain or opportunity. And that's where people typically spend money. And if you have enough pain, so Jeep had enough pain with that incident and that vulnerability that they recalled 1.5 million cars and they fixed it. And I guarantee you, and I know firsthand that FCA is actually doing a lot of really good things in cybersecurity now because of that. But they waited until they felt pain to spend the money. The other way people spend money is based on opportunity. And right now, have you seen any IoT devices that, it's like, hey, the most secure device on the market? You don't see that right now, right?
Yeah.
Consumers aren't buying based on cyber. And I don't know that they should, and I don't know that opportunity will ever become a differentiator for product. It might. If vulnerabilities become so bad that people, it's having a big impact. But I tend to believe that it's going to be the pain that's going to cause more spending. And so our message and what we try to do is go out and help organizations see the potential of pain and help them anticipate what it could look like if their products were exploited, and help them start thinking through, is it better to spend money today to prevent those things from happening? I guarantee you FCA spent a lot more money and they got hit in their stock price, and the hit was a lot more because of that vulnerability than if they would have built security in from the beginning into their architecture and product design, and they tested for security and did all of those things. It costs a lot less money to build it into your process than to react.
So, you mentioned that it is they have to feel the financial pain, which will come from the consumer. So as consumers, are there things that we can do to kind of help shape the direction of the industry so that it is more secure over the long run?
Yeah, you look at things like Mariah botnet and some of the other attacks that have happened. Hard-coded credentials are a no-no, right? California legislature just passed a cybersecurity law that, it's a low bar. I'm not going to point to that as like a gold star for cybersecurity standards, but it does have some strong language around hard-coded credentials and requiring any IoT device, minus a handful of industries like healthcare and others. But it really has a heavy hit on hard-coded credentials. So if you're a consumer and you open up the user manual and see there's hard-coded credentials, and you're using that, to monitor your baby or to use it for a home security camera, or hard-coded credentials, if you have that, you can pretty much expect that your device is going to get hacked. And that's something consumers can look at. My take, though, on cyber is that consumers shouldn't have to. I get asked that all the time, is, what can consumers do? And my belief is that consumers should have the right to have an assumption of security.
Yeah.
Let's take an example. So my 4-year-old daughter, Olivia, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes a year ago. And my wife and I took her into the hospital, and she got hooked up to an infusion pump, and she got hooked up to all these medical devices. And all of them, a handful of them, had no wires going in. So I knew there was wireless communication going on. I knew that the data was being passed from the device to an EHR or wherever the record keeping system was. And because I'm a security-minded person, of course I was thinking about that. But I promise you, as my daughter was sitting there, the thought occurred to me, should I as a parent or as a consumer need to ask the doctor, hey, is my data that's being passed from that device to the EHR being encrypted? Or, is that connection that's coming in, or is that device going to update when I'm in the process of having my surgery? Like, those are not things that I should, as a consumer, need to worry about. I think manufacturers have the burden to secure those devices, and consumers really, when they go in for care, or when you're buying a home security camera, or when you're buying your automobile, you should have the assurance that the manufacturer has handled security and that it's been taken care of.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree with you, but again, like you said, it's they're going to have to make that decision on their own. Then it seems. I don't know.
Yeah. And now, knowing that, there are best practices consumers can do. So if they're hard-coded credentials, change them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that they can do, but a lot of those back-end connections and the updates and things like that, consumers don't really see, and they don't have the ability to check to see unless you call the manufacturer and say, hey, give me the architecture of the security that you put on this device. It's hard for consumers to know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, we're also here to talk about how PKI, public key infrastructure, could potentially mitigate some of these risks. But I was hoping you could kind of take a step back and kind of walk us through an intro to PKI, and just so folks can understand the technology and maybe the context and where it comes from.
Yeah, so public key infrastructure is, unlike a lot of security solutions that are out there, it's not snake oil. It's a technology that's been used for decades to secure web connections, and even in the IoT space, fax machines and ATMs, and it's a technology that's been used for over a decade to secure connected devices. And the technology itself is, it is complicated, and it's important to do it right. But the underlying technology, and the way I like to explain it, is, it all starts with roots, and roots are devices that spin off. What we typically do in the IoT case is you have a protected private root, and all of your certificates and the things that we do have to chain up to that root. And if that chain is broken, then that connection can no longer be trusted. The security of that root is of utmost importance. And so we secure all of those roots in offline secure storage facilities, and we protect those very aggressively. From those private roots, we spin off what are called intermediate roots. And those intermediates are the provisioning roots, where the digital certificates that we utilize come from. And this is both on the public SSL side, where we're issuing public certificates for web servers. But the same is true on the IoT side. It's just the difference between a public root and a private root. A public root would be one that touches the internet or touches a browser like Chrome or Mozilla. If your device is utilizing a browser, public trust is needed. But when 99% of the deployments we do in IoT, the device operates in a trusted private network. And in those instances, private trust can be utilized in private routes. So anyways, we issue those intermediate CAs, and then those intermediate CAs are the intermediates that actually provision the certificates and where those certificates come from. And the underlying technology is pretty simple. We provision a digital certificate to an end device, and then we provision a certificate, a matching certificate to a server or whatever is connecting to that device. And when that connection occurs, the device checks the certificate, makes sure that it's still valid, and that it chains up to the trusted root. And that verifies that it has integrity and that it's coming from a trusted source. And if it chains up to the trusted root and the certificate is still valid, you have an assurance that that connection is trusted. And it opens up a connected tunnel, an encrypted tunnel, where communication can flow freely, knowing that it's secure. And that same technology applies with SSL certificates, but also on the IoT side.
Okay. So for all the same devices that we were talking about, smartwatches, smart coffee makers, smart fridges, basically you would need a certificate on both the device itself as well as in order to connect to whatever data source is looking to receive that information. Is that kind of accurate description? Yeah. Okay.
It is. Yeah, and every ecosystem is different. And I think the smart thing, and I know this, it sounds like a sales pitch, but if public key infrastructure is a complicated and a technical solution, and it's important to make sure you do it right. For example, if you store your root or your keys in the open and they're vulnerable to someone getting a hold of them, they can go and they can masquerade around as a trusted actor. And they could send a malware package to your device, and all of a sudden you have a massive problem on your hands. And so, when you're doing it, I always encourage people to make sure that they have PKI experts in the room, that they're making sure that they're doing it right, so that they don't make some of the challenges or the mistakes that we see manufacturers make that ends up causing them a lot of pain.
Now, is PKI infrastructure something that would have to come from the manufacturer side, or as a consumer, is this something that we could be utilizing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't seen consumers. So let me give you one example where we have seen consumers in the broad sense of the term consumer. Let's look at healthcare. So manufacturer sells a big diagnostic device, big MRI or a CAT scan machine to a hospital. A hospital would then be considered a consumer. We've had a handful of big healthcare organizations actually come to us and say, hey, look, we've scanned all of the medical devices in our hospital, and we know that 15% of them can support PKI. The manufacturers didn't put that on during manufacturing, but we know that the device's operating system can support certificate-based authentication. And we want to provision a certificate to that. And we've actually worked with a handful of hospitals to do those types of deployments. I don't know that I would see, myself as a consumer, if my Nest cameras or whatnot didn't have those, that's much less of a likely scenario. But in the consumer, in the type of scenario that I described around, a hospital that's utilizing a handful of these devices, they're utilizing them for patient care, they're doing those types of things. The manufacturer has sold it to them and is, they don't always wash their hands of them, but a lot of times they're like, look, here's some security best practices. Now you go and do what you do. It does make sense for organizations like that to stand up a PKI and leverage that to provision to devices that can support that type of security infrastructure.
Okay. And then so you listed a couple of examples of companies that are using PKI for these devices. Is your sense that this will continue to rise? And again, is there something that we can do as consumers to maybe potentially influence that?
Yeah, I think for consumers, always asking questions helps. I think that's important. Remind me the question you asked right before that. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, do you see that growing? Is your sense that PKI will be one of the tools that will lead to IoT security? And is this something that as consumers you should be trying to promote?
Yeah, I think it will. I think PKI will continue to have a role, and its role will continue to grow. When DigiCert hired me 4 years ago, I went to a conference up in Minneapolis that I spoke at, and I was just teaching the core components of PKI. And at the beginning, all manufacturers were in the room from different ecosystems, different industries, and I asked the question: how many of you are currently utilizing or have plans in the next year or two to leverage PKI to secure your devices? And of an audience of about 100, maybe 150, I had one hand that was raised. When I ask that question today, almost every hand goes up. So we've seen a dramatic increase over the last 4 years in manufacturers that are starting to look at it and leverage PKI to secure their devices.
And then we got a ton of questions coming in already, but if you could briefly kind of talk about DigiCert's offering around PKI and what folks ought to know about it if they did want to incorporate this into their own infrastructure.
Yeah. So as I've said, there are a lot of complexities about PKI, and it's important to make sure you do it right. We've had a lot of manufacturers go down the path of kind of standing up and managing their own public key infrastructure, and then 6 months to a year in, they're like, oh my gosh, what have we gotten ourselves into? And they come and ask for our help. So the things that I encourage people to look at is making sure that you're doing it right. DigiCert's offering, so we do everything from professional consulting. We have organizations that come to us and they manage their own CA, but they want us to do a gut check on it, and they want us to see if what they've stood up is sound. And so we've helped organizations to go through and review and help them make sure and assess the strength of their PKI. DigiCert is a certificate authority. We're the largest certificate authority globally. And what that means is we're a provisioner of digital certificates. DigiCert was founded in the early 2000s around the principle. It was funny, our founder actually went to try to buy a certificate, and it was like the most challenging experience he had ever had. And so he said, there's got to be an easier way. There's got to be a way to make the purchasing and the management of certificates better. So our company was founded on innovating around better solutions, creating a better customer experience, so that when people have the challenges and they run into some of those complexities, they have somebody to call who can help them walk through it and help resolve that. And ultimately trust, doing it the right way. Ultimately, everything we do is linked up to trust. And we've never been hacked. We have a perfect record, and we're very proud, very proud of that. And we're constantly innovating to make sure what we're doing is ahead of the curve. Our solutions in the IoT space are really using digital certificates to authenticate connections. So certificate-based authentication. So your device is connecting to a server, your device is connecting to another device. We offer digital certificates that can be provisioned, and we help with the provisioning, we help with the management. We offer those certificates that can be utilized for certificate-based authentication. The other thing those digital certificates can be leveraged for is encryption. So when that authenticated session is begun, our certificates can be leveraged to encrypt any data that's moving in transit or being stored in the memory or in process on the device. The last thing, around what our digital certificates can do is the assurance of integrity. Making sure that the values are, if you're sending a package, an update down to a device, how do you know that it hasn't been intercepted and that malware's been embedded and that you're about to install malware on your device? We have a couple tools. We have a very robust code signing platform that allows manufacturers, when they're sending updates, to know that those messages have not been altered since the time they were developed by the manufacturer and then sent down and received by the device. And so that's really, I talk about it as frictionless authentication, encryption, the assurance of integrity, and then some of the tools we have around code signing and whatnot help facilitate some of that.
All right, cool. So like I mentioned, we got a ton of questions from the audience. So let's go with Joe B13. As someone with no background with PKI, what would we need to look for and ask in a partner, DigiCert or others, in order to help and guide our implementation?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And you're not alone in being new to PKI. We have a lot of security teams actually that reach out and they're like, hey, we're cybersecurity experts, but we don't know anything about PKI. So you're not alone in that boat. So I always say digital certificates are really a commodity. You can get a certificate almost anywhere these days. The important things around the digital certificate are the management tools that you have around it. So questions around, all right, so we want to use certificates to authenticate a connection. How are you going to get that certificate to the device? When are you going to get that certificate to the device? Are you going to do it at manufacturing? Are you going to do it once it's in the field and it has its first connection up to the internet? Are you going to utilize it then? Thinking through those types of scenarios. The provisioning, if you have an issue with a certificate and you need to revoke a certificate, do you have the tools in place for revocation? Do you have the tools in place to automate things like renewal? Certificates have validity periods, and those validity periods can be anywhere from seconds to years. And having a policy in place where you know what the right validity period is for your device, and it's working, and then to have the tools to help you manage that. And DigiCert has built a lot of automated tools to help with things like renewal, revocation, validity checking on certificates to make sure that your device can look to make sure that the certificate it's matching up to is actually valid and hasn't been revoked. So those are the things and some of the complexities we see manufacturers make mistakes around. And I'd encourage you to think through some of those items.
All right. Let's get a question from Dread Pirates T. Roberts. How long before do you think vendors will start adding anti-malware software as part of IoT devices, since none seem to have some at this time? Is that something you see being necessary?
Well, so it depends. I mean, sure, you can use that, but code signing does the same thing. And it's, it's something that you can build into your product in a seamless and frictionless way without having to put something else in. So, I think that anti-malware, I haven't seen that discussed a ton. I mean, most of the discussions we have are around utilizing code signing to prevent the addition of malware that's going to devices.
Okay, cool. Here's a question from Kip130, very relevant to today's going on right now. How about securing voting machines? Do you think that PKI could potentially be a solution for that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great use case for public key infrastructure. I mean, PKI is really needed. PKI is really needed when you need the assurance that the person on this side and the person on this side, or the device on this side and the device on this side, are who they say they are. So with voting, you need to know that the person on the other end is who they say they are. And PKI is a way to assign an identity to that individual, and that identity that can then be used to cast a ballot or anything like that. And so it is a way to validate identities, and PKI is a great way to do that.
And by the way, early voting opened in many states, including Texas. So
there you go. Very good. Get out and vote, everybody.
All right. Along another political question, because why not? Artie wants to know, do you think it will take regulations to correct the issue of security in IoT devices, or do you think vendors will do it on their own?
Yeah, that's a great topic. I just returned from California. I was on a panel down there, and we had a very robust discussion around the difference between regulation and industry standards. I'm a believer that industry standards developed by consortiums are a better approach than heavy-handed regulation. We look at industries. So finance the financial industry was able to get together with PCI and create a standard that all cards comply with, and that solution has worked flawlessly in society. I believe that. Let me give you a couple more examples of industry collaborations that have created standards. The cable industry. there's an organization called Cable Labs, and they are responsible for creating industry standards collectively and collaboratively with all of the manufacturers for cable devices. PKI was a big part of that security standard that Cable Labs developed over a decade ago. And they have, over the last decade, we've provisioned well over 500 million certificates. The chance is if you have cable technology in your home, it has a digital certificate from DigiCert on it, and it's being used to authenticate those connections. That's another example where the industry came together. They've had no issues. They created a security standard that was shared collectively by all the manufacturers, and they all agreed to play to that. We're starting to see some consortiums in the consumer space. There's a Open Connectivity Forum, the OCF, that we're getting involved in, and they've asked us to come in and help create the standard for consumer technology. And we're going to be the root of trust that will be at the anchor of a lot of that. And so we're starting to see that. In some industries like healthcare, the devices are so different. It's kind of hard for those types of industries to come out and say, hey, here is a standard. You almost need a standard for diagnostic devices, implanted devices, diabetes devices. I mean, all of those devices are so different in the way they communicate and their operating systems that you almost need unique standards for each of those silos. But I still think the better way to go is to work collaboratively to create those standards.
Cool.
One other thing that I would say is, we see areas where regulation is starting to get involved. In healthcare, the Food and Drug Administration is actually starting to have a lot heavier language around cybersecurity, and they're requiring manufacturers to do cybersecurity testing before their devices are approved for consumer use. And I think that's good, but they haven't got so specific as to define a standard. But I'm confident if in the next 5 years, if the industry doesn't do it, I think they'll take a heavier hand. You look at Department of Transportation, they're getting much more involved in V2V and V2X, vehicle to vehicle and vehicle to infrastructure communication to make sure that those standards are actually going to work at a large scale. And so, we see regulatory bodies getting involved in some areas. Some of it I think is good, but what I see happening in those cases is you don't get the technical experts actually writing the standard, and you end up having a lot of frustration and challenges with the deployment of those.
Okay. Question from Spectre01101. Security is overlooked in IoT, likely because of cost and profitability. Do you see open source potentially filling this gap or helping at all?
Yeah, I do think open source can be a way to advance the adoption of good security. And so I think it definitely has a role in the future of IoT security, and I think we'll start seeing more and more of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Question from B. Scott King. Are there any IoT devices that can't be secured or ones that we should just stay away from entirely?
So, when I look at IoT security, I look at it through two different lenses. One is devices that are coming to market, and then the other lens is devices that are actually already deployed and are being utilized. For products that are being manufactured right now, there is no reason good cybersecurity should not be built in. So the answer to the question on new devices is no. Cybersecurity should be architected in any type of device that has connectivity. As you look at legacy systems, there's a lot more challenging problems to solve. And I see that as one of the biggest pain points for large manufacturers like Siemens and Philips and GE, who just have these massive legacy devices that they put into the field maybe 10 years ago, but they have a 20-year shelf life. So they need to be used for the next 10 years, but they have connectivity. How do you go back and retro security into a device? It's really hard and it's complicated. And the answer to that, we've actually seen some where manufacturers have stripped encryption libraries out of it because it saved them money, and it didn't take as much consumption power. So we've seen manufacturers who have compromised on security, 10 years ago, and they're now paying for those decisions today because they know they need to go back and do some type of security improvement on those devices. And unfortunately, they strip some of the things that they could be doing out at the time of manufacturing. So there are devices where it is really challenging to do something, but it should still always be considered. And a big factor into that is also understanding risk. Not every device really has really high risk. And so one of the things manufacturers needs to do is to really assess and understand the risk level of the device and what the likelihood of compromise and the consequence of compromise is if there's an exploit.
All right. A question from Ben Setliff and wants to know, do you ever see individuals, like certificates being at an individual level? Will the internet ever require such high security levels that end users will need a personal certificate to access secure websites?
Yeah, I mean, there's some emerging technology in the blockchain space and digital identity that I think is really interesting in that space, where certificates can be a form of identity for your digital footprint, and you can carry that around, and it can be used to identify you appropriately in different places. And so I do think that in some of that emerging technology that there could definitely be a role, and we're having some meaningful conversations in that space around blockchain and have a few pilots that are running where we're validating identities of individuals and organizations as well. But there's some interesting stuff there.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. We've got one from Computer Nations. So if an IoT device gets disconnected from the internet for a long time and the certificate and the CRL is updated, how do you deal with the revocation or renewal process, even if it's years after the device was registered?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's one that we're dealing with a lot in like the industrial control space, where a lot of there's a lot of offline technology, and it's a challenging problem to solve, but it's not unconquerable. We have some innovative approaches that that we see manufacturers taking that leveraging things like CRLs or OCSP. To whether you store those on the device, that where the device can then go and leverage that to check the validity and do things like that. But one of the important things around PKI for that is looking at the validity period of the device and making sure that if it's a high risk device and it's sitting in an environment like that, making sure that you're doing the right things around validity period, making sure that you understand the times at which those devices are going to be making connections, and when that connection is made, making sure that it's doing the right things to assure that security and things are still in place. And if it's not, having a method in place to be able to then go and to renew or replace that certificate. There's a very long discussion we could have around that, and I would be happy, whoever it was that asked that question, I would be happy to get on. And we've got actually a presentation where we show some process flows that work through some of those challenges, and we've got a handful of different ways in which we've solved that.
Okay. All right. I've got a question from Crazy Lefty. So what do you recommend as a good way to transport and secure the actual certificate when distributing a key to be used for encryption? I know email's out, so what's the other alternative? USB through the mail?
Yeah. So HSMs are always a key component. Secure storage is always a key component when transferring things like that. And there are companies that offer those types of movable HSMs. And so I would look into that and leverage secure storage instead of just a plain USB.
All right. And then I think we're starting to wrap up with Berto 007 recap of it, and wants to know, what if you could just recap the best practices to secure an IoT device that needs to send data to other systems? What would those best practices be?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few essential cybersecurity hygiene elements. One, you need to make sure all connections are properly authenticated. 2, you need to encrypt any sensitive data. 3, you need to use code signing on any firmware update or package that's being sent and run on your device. Code signing is essential. Don't run anything on your device that has not been authenticated and is leveraging a technology like code signing. And then the other things, those are things once they're deployed and making sure that they're secure. Build security in from the get-go. Make sure that security is part of your architecture, part of your design, part of your testing and validation. Bring in penetration or security researcher, penetration testers or security researchers, and give them access to your device and let them hack it and come back to you and tell you where your vulnerabilities are. And then look at those seriously and put in place the right protections to make sure that you're adequately dealing with those risks. And then the last thing I would say is cybersecurity is an evolving game. And we at DigiCert take the evolving nature of security very seriously, and so should any manufacturer. You can't just, today's security practices are not going to be the best practices in 2 years. And so you need to have a strategy for continuing to evolve your practices to make sure that you're always staying ahead of the curve. Because, whether it's quantum computing or anything that's going to come in the future, you want to make sure that you're evolving to stay ahead of, the bad guys.
All right, well, awesome. Well, I think that just about covers it. Thank you again, Mike. It's now time to announce the winner of our prize. So the winners of our 34-inch, 36-inch monitors are going to go to Stugatz72 and Angie. Congratulations, Stugatz72 and Angie. You guys are the winners of our LG monitors. Please hit up Matt Y in the community and let him know where you would like those monitors shipped. And big thanks again to Mike and to DigiCert for sponsoring today's event. I definitely learned a lot. I definitely think our audience did as well. So I hope we get a chance to do this again soon. For all, if you want more information about DigiCert and PKI, make sure to check out the downloads in the resource list. And if you'd like to see what other events we've got coming up really today, make sure to check out the orange button or just stick around after the event. And you can see all the other stuff that we've got coming planned. So without further ado, thanks again, guys. Stay safe, keep it spicy, and we'll see you guys back here next time.
Thanks, Justin.